Rahner says of himself that as a young man, he was, as he said, even his family would have described him as somewhat withdrawn and grumpy. And certainly if you look at photos of Rahner as a child and even more particularly as a young adult, you see this not exactly surly, but a man who's very much locked in with his own thoughts and feelings, even in the midst of a group. Rahner joins the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, in 1922 at the age of 18, so immediately out of high school. In joining the Jesuits, he followed his brother Hugo, his slightly older brother. Hugo had joined in 1919. Hugo served in the First World War, and on leaving the army at the end of the war, he joined the Jesuits. Karl says of his own religious vocation, what led him in that direction, that it simply was the product of his life. In other words, there was no dramatic events, no great conversion experiences. Faith had been central to his family. Faith had been the environment in which he grew up. He was himself a person of prayer. And so there's almost, if not an inevitability about it, nothing shocking about it. Nor does it seem to be a decision over which he greatly anguished or that he talked closely with family and friends and so on. It's simply who he was and the direction that he moved. He was to be 60 years a Jesuit and 50 years as a priest after his ordination at the age of 28. The society that Rahner joined, the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, was both theologically and culturally conservative. The cultural conservatism reflective of 19th century German life. The German Catholic Church had undergone lots of upheaval in the 19th century, and that had made it more conservative. The theological conservatism, really reflection of the church at large at that time. Most theology was still commentaries on the works of St. Thomas Aquinas, what's known as neo-scholasticism, that really the recycling of Thomas rather than great creative thought that Thomas himself had done. Rahner did all his theology studies in Latin, and even though he himself found that quite remarkable as he got older, that was still the language of instruction. It was, in fact, to stand Rahner in good stead when Vatican II came along, and I'll mention that later. Where Rahner's life and theology begin to become far more interesting and to grow is when he begins doctoral studies. He returned to the University of Freiburg to do his doctorate in theology, and there he spent time attending the doctoral seminars of Martin Heidegger. Heidegger was not a theologian. He would certainly describe himself as a philosopher, so came from not the traditional Catholic way of doing things that Rahner had been exposed to in his earlier studies. Heidegger's great question was about being. What does it mean to be a being in the world? What does it mean to be a person in history? So he wasn't dealing directly with questions of God, but he was dealing directly with questions of human existence. And that was important for the evolution of Rahner's own thought. Rahner was also significantly influenced by the Belgian Jesuit philosopher Joseph Maréchal, who again had departed from Thomas or perhaps reappropriated Thomas in more creative ways. So, not working directly under Heidegger, but certainly influenced by participating in Heidegger's doctoral seminars, Rahner writes his thesis at the University of Freiburg. And it's really a retrieval of Thomas's understanding of being. So reflecting the influence and the dialogue with Heidegger, Maréchal and other contemporary thought. Rahner's doctoral supervisor, though, failed Rahner's thesis, regarded it as not faithful to Thomas. Now, for lots of people, that probably would have been the end of the academic story. Not many people with a failed doctorate, though, end up having it published and becoming one of the great theological works of the century, which is exactly what happened with Rahner. His failed thesis eventually is published as Spirit in the World, which is the seminal Rahner work on humanity in relationship to God. In the meantime, Rahner had already been appointed